Recognizing the inadequacies of the human mind, I merged my psyche with the computer in an attempt to find a deeper understanding of this quandary in which we find ourselves. And lo, I did find sorrow.
It is perhaps telling that an anxiety is still apparent in our society around the influence of technology and its potential inevitable superiority over humanity. We have been constantly shifting from admiration to fear and back again. This tension that's built up between humanity and technology makes them seem as if they were opposites. Posthumanism offers a different view of this matter. It is interested in the relationship between humanity and technology, how they merge, and what changes does this increasingly intimate relationship bring. It examines humans as cyborgs, as we are increasingly using technology as part of ourselves, as extensions of our bodies. This essay will explore how does this theory relate to the video game medium, specifically in the use of controller and the avatar as extensions of self. I'll be looking at an example of a video game with a narrative about cyborg qualities, and examine if it has anything meaningful to say on posthumanism. To ascertain this, I'll analyze the game's narrative and examine the motivation behind the construction of the story, both in terms of its writers and of the players who form individual storylines by making game-prompted choices. To make some points, I'll use the statistics of in-game choices which are collected by the game. These come from 2 months after the game's release and might therefore reflect multiple replayings, not just the first take, and it is not known to me if and how they are modified. Posthumanism challenges humanism as a long-prevailing definition of what it means to be human. It argues that we have outgrown humanism as humanity changes, transformed by technology. The technological development, especially of the past 20 years, makes boundaries between the human and the non-human brittle and unconvincing. Since the 1980s, we can find an increasing amount of references to the human-machine merger across screen media. There is still a looming fear of technological advancement and the uncanny, even if there is a shift of contemporary perception of technology and its place in our society, as argued in this quote. 40 years ago, the dominant narrative still saw technology mainly as a deterministic force working alongside humanity for good or ill. In contrast, the early 21st century has adopted the view that we are, deep down, inseparable from our technologies. We have lost our fear, or if not exactly lost it, found a way to accept the beneficial sides of this merger and its hopeful prospects. This new notion of technology is apparent in the narrative of Detroit Become Human, a video game that attempts to discuss the position of technology in today's world and in the near future. The story of Detroit Become Human is set in 2038, and human-like robots are used for all kinds of undesirable, dangerous or demanding jobs, as servants, policemen, sex workers, working in hospitality, security or with the elderly. A difference is made between normal androids, who are subject to their strictly logic programming, and deviants, who behave irrationally as a result of experiencing the robot equivalent of emotions. The game tries to explore the nature of human machines. The post-humanist understanding of technology as an extension of human bodies can be understood in relation to video games generally. Video games are by nature an immersive medium, and very often they are designed to make the player feel like they are in the game world, embodied by the avatar. The humanity of the player merges with the technology of the game. Out of all the media, video games are perhaps the most capable of using the audience's physicality, beyond just oral and visual perception and bodily reactions. A controller is used as an extension of self and effectively turns players into cyborgs, as the control becomes part of their bodies when interacting with the game. This is manifested in any video game, but especially evident in video games that use this as an immersive tool when they make the player and the player character as one, like this game does. Magica is a fantasy video game based around combining elements in unique ways to cast spells. The game can be played with mouse and keyboard, or with a controller. Expectedly, it is much easier to play on a keyboard, while using an extra key for each element the player wants to incorporate in the spell. However, using a controller creates a different kind of experience. There aren't different buttons for different elements, instead the right joystick is used and certain movements conjure the different elements. To cast a spell, then, the player is required to follow a succession of joystick movements, conjuring up to 4 elements, and then using a button to combine them and cast a spell. Playing the game with a controller makes it harder, making each spell take up more time, but it also creates a more immersive, authentic wizard experience, as it transforms the joystick into a magic wand, and through that turns the body of the player into that of a wizard. The game offers an immersion in the form of combining our personhood with an artificial person on screen. Most games use a character to allow engagement with the game. In fact, in some cases the player character is nothing but a tool of engagement. Such an avatar has an android-like quality. They look human, yet are clearly not human. This is what makes Detroit Become Human quite clever. All the playable characters are androids. A robot as the protagonist, through whom the player experiences this game world, justifies the inherent artificiality that video games have to admit anyway. Games reveal information which the player characters wouldn't have access to, and certainly not in the form of a floating health bar or a text box stating their current objective. This usually creates a rift between the player and the player character, between the human and the technology. But here it's used to unite the player and the player character into one cyborg-like consciousness. As exemplified in this scene, where having control over the android Connor, the player is given the statistical information that Connor would think in terms of, which then affects the decision whether or not to help his colleague Hank, who is potentially in a life-threatening situation. By pointing out the statistical probability of Hank's survival, many players choose to leave him hanging off the rooftop. The game justifies the exposure of this information with the story. It embraces the fact that its characters are cyborgs, merges of the game's code and the player's presence. However focused on the topics of technology and its purposes, there is another topic the game addresses. Detroit Become Human follows the story of a revolution for android rights, the result of which depends on the player's choices. It would seem that the game is trying to make a point about racial issues by creating a parallel between its story and that of American racism history. As exemplified by the slogans the androids use as they protest, the concentration camps they end up in if they are deemed less than human, or the line,
"Deviant's blood may be a different color than mine, but they're alive."
After all, the reason the game is set in Detroit is because of its history of racial tension, culminating in the 1967 Detroit riot.
The city of Detroit came very quickly to my mind because it had already an incredible story by itself full of history and themes. And we could really feel the desire to fight and really be born again.
Perhaps with this metaphor in mind, the game manipulates its players into feeling a certain way about the androids. Apart from making the player side with the deviants by having them play for the deviant revolutionist leader, the game often contrasts self-indulgent human characters with the compassion of the player, which equals to the compassion of the deviant player characters. The most dystopic ending a player can reach lies in destroying the androids and never granting them the rights. They were destroyed because the machines became scarily human-like. This ending is obviously not encouraged by the game and is phrased as a loss, proving the modern tendency to make peace with technology and accept it as part of humanity rather than to cut it off out of fear. According to the in-game statistics, players tend to pick options that lead the story to the conclusion that androids and humans should be equal. The decision to turn one of the protagonists into a deviant was followed through by 77% of the players. Players choose to blur the line between humans and machines and embrace the idea that robots can be perfectly like humans. So the game manipulates its players into siding with the deviants, which is justified by the game's metaphor of racial issues. But does this metaphor work? The parallel between Detroit's black population in the 60s and Detroit's robots in 2030s is misleading. Even if about race and racism, the game's characters still have to deal with their physical circumstance of their existence, not just their place in the society. In this sense, Detroit Become Human seems to advocate transhumanism, the theory that technological advancement can make humanity more enhanced. The player takes control of the different androids as they become human when they go deviant, and so can decide for themselves and feel emotions. By the end, the game finds no difference between human characters and deviant characters emotion-wise, but the androids do the dangerous jobs because their bodies are just better, technologically more advanced. The game seems to see the androids as the next stage of humanity, as enhanced humans with better physical and just as good emotional abilities. While it's arguing that even negative emotions are inherently part of humanity, which is against what transhumanists typically argue, the very discussion of these problematics is what separates it from its racial metaphor. The artificially produced future in the game is rooted in today's perception of technology and today's conventions in the society. Detroit Become Human might then be harmful with its would-be posthumanist notions of technology, which are disrupted by the racial metaphor that instructs the optimism behind the android's human level of self-awareness.